Hello, and welcome to the continuation in our introduction to patriarchy. Now, before lecturing on what is patriarchy, I have to add a caveat. For you see, for this lecture that I'm giving, for women, this is a subject they don't need to study. This is a subject that they lived the minute they were able to comprehend the words spoken around them, and were conscious of the actions taken towards them as a result of the difference, not biological difference, but we call it constructed differences known as gender. Patriarchy for myself was something that I had to study, something that I had to learn. But as I go in this lecture, everything that I'm talking about here, a woman, and no woman can escape it. Every woman has experienced some form of patriarchy discussed in this lecture. So let's just review the various levels of patriarchy that I discussed. And they include religious. So this is levels of patriarchy usually in some kind of religious scripture. It's exhibited in norms in the way women dress or according to faith. Patriarchy of the state is those mechanisms usually embedded in laws. Okay? It's also related to the politicians and either their attitudes towards women or policies they implement that affect women. And those are the two we'll be talking about in this lecture. In the next lecture, we'll be talking about linguistic and narrative. Okay? The words and images we use, as well as how patriarchy occurs in the media. And one form of media then we'll focus specifically on is the market and economy. Usually to sell a product, these are usually advertisements. And then if you can't, these are the dominant levels. If you find some space where 1 through 5 don't fit perfectly, I create a level that is kind of societal. Patriarchy exhibited within daily social life. And finally, collectively, I argue all 6 levels constitute the culture of patriarchy. So let's begin with religious. Here is an example of a set of recommendation, prohibitions, and regulations. Now, this was posted on a door of a rural church in Spain. It's July 11th, 1943. Okay. But if you see here, this is an example of a religious institution, even though it's just a singular church, okay? But dictating how women should appear so that they do not incite lust among men. Okay. Dictating that they can't wear short sleeves in a country that's quite hot. Okay. Their dresses, stockings. Now, if we keep on going, dresses that reach the knee. And then we only have one line that deals with little boys, but that's it. No decent woman or girl is ever seen on a bicycle, wearing trousers, or partaking in modern dancing. Now, it's not just, so in history, we would consider this a primary source. It reveals the attitudes towards gender in the 1940s, right? But the secondary source from which I get it is an Atlantic article, okay? And so why is the Atlantic in the year 2012 interested in these regulations posted on this church door? It's because it's trying to show us, it's commenting on a debate around 2012 on Muslim women. And what is the Atlantic then doing in this case? It is trying to show, just as we, in other words, we, quote unquote, in Western secular modern societies might find Muslim dress as an anachronism or archaic, this article wants to remind us that you have the similar attitudes embedded within Christianity as well. It's just something we tend to forget. Okay? And then if we zoom out and situate this article, okay, Look on the right. What is there a follow-up link to? A discussion of the veil, or in this case, particularly the Muslim veil, and the way states try to regulate it. When they say the danger of banning religious garb, who is banning religious garb? It's a secular state like France, trying to ban, let's say, the burqa. Another, in this case, me, demonstrating that what we associate with kind of the garb of, according to Muslim scripture, is also the same as similar garb found in Christian culture, or in this particular case, Catholic culture. Okay. And if we look then at this image here, what is this a reminder of? And this is something we will discuss. Why do Jews, Catholics, Orthodox women, and Muslim wear the veil? Okay. Now here, this is trying to show a double standard in modern society. But what we're going to answer in this class is there is a historical reason. We have to interrogate, why is there a continuity? Because what do all four women share in common? They all adhere to what we would call Abrahamic faiths, okay? Or three faiths that claim Abraham as a religious patriarch. And in this context, we're going to study why is veiling common amongst all three faiths, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Okay, now patriarchy of the state, I use this sarcastic image from crack.com. This is an actual image. The photoshopped image of somebody filming Girls Gone Wild is an example of something I would call patriarchy of the media. Okay. If you don't know, this was a show in the 90s, early 2000s that just filmed girls going wild. And basically, what did that constitute? Mostly women taking off their tops. And of course, there is no show called Men Gone Wild because that's just called TV. Or in other words, yeah, men taking off their shirts isn't such a big deal. So but of course, that image is a real image. In other words, when we talk about patriarchy of the state, historically, patriarchy of the state, in terms of the modern state, was the denial of women the right to vote, and the campaign or the modern movement of feminism to achieve the right to vote, or in other words, to achieve the right of the mass of women. 50% of the population is women, and a certain percentage of voting age is to empower that demographic. Now, this is an example of the various culture that emerged that denied women having a role or voice in choosing their leaders or voting on laws. Now, you have to realize in this particular cartoon, this word suffragette is derogatory. The proper term, what did we say? Any ism refers to a political ideology and deals with mass. So the proper term here would be a suffragism, okay? And then the adherent of this modern ideology would be a suffragist. A suffragette, what does that sound like? It sounds like somebody, coquette, these kind of diminutive words that are supposed to also diminish the feminist movement calling for the right to vote. And look at this. The minute you call women a suffragette, it just happens to rhyme to the disadvantage of the woman being depicted here. At 15, a little pet. At 20, a little coquette. At 40, not married yet. At 50, a suffragette. Okay. Now this is dealing with politics, but then again, there's linguistic, political, social patriarchy embedded in this entire image. And we'll break this down and we'll refer to this image quite commonly. Okay. But what was a cartoon like this supposed to do? It was supposed to delegitimize the feminist movement or the suffragist movement. In other words, the quest to have a voice in the affairs of state. Most of you probably don't realize what this is, but this is something called a scold. Okay. And what was a scold designed for? Now, you might look at this and automatically think it's a chastity belt. It's something along that line, okay? A scold was some punishment, usually given to a woman who either gossiped or complained too much about her husband. Okay? You see, if you look previously, if you see that spike, what was that design? That spike went under a woman's tongue so she could not talk. And if she did, her tongue would get pierced. That's a scold. If a chastity belt was a means of denying a woman's sexuality, this kind of implement was a mean of literally denying a woman's voice. Okay. But look at that scold in those times, okay? And compare it to this image from what I would do with the suffragist. Okay, at least this image used the proper term, but still is, do you see what is in common? Even in the modern period, if we look at this and juxtapose it with the image on the right, both, of course, both, if we break down the image on the left, deny the women the right to have a voice. But this is also kind of saying to a suffragist, this is what you deserve. You're going to also be drowned. Where do you find sentiments like that? Well, later I'm going to show you a primary source called the Law of Hammurabi. And notice, so where does the law of Hammurabi come from? We're talking about ancient Mesopotamia. We're talking about antiquity. And you see, even back then, look at the patriarchy of the state in the ancient Babylonian state. If a woman was not careful, but was a tramp, neglecting her house and humiliating her husband. Now remember that the earlier punishment, the scold, was for a woman who humiliated her husband. That woman shall be thrown into the water, not in terms of having a bath. In other words, that woman would be drowned. So we see this sentiment, whether it's pre-modern patriarchy in ancient times or modern patriarchy. Both are examples of patriarchy of the state. And both are dictating that women should either be shut up or drowned as a means of denying them a role. That's it, just denying them agency. Now, look at the image here. At 50, a suffragette. Now, here you have to understand historical context at the time. Why is this woman referred to wearing an axe? Sorry, not wearing an axe, but wielding an axe, okay? It's referring to an incident that happened at a British museum. And we see this incident being recreated here, where a woman has entered the museum with an axe, okay, and has scratched, well, we could say hacked a particular painting, and now she's being apprehended. What happened? Well, let's look at how these various levels combine: state, societal, and market patriarchy. The painting that was hacked was by Velázquez, and it's known as the Rockaby Venus. The woman that hacked it didn't object to the painting. She wasn't saying this painting objectified women. Okay? In fact, she found the painting beautiful. But through the painting, she wanted to make a message. What was that? So what you do is you take that painting and then you take the axe to it. For what purpose? To get on the front page of the newspaper. So the minute this woman was able to get on the front page of the newspapers, through her action, she was able to reach a mass or modern audience. This is what makes this a modern act of feminism. Through the mass publication and mass circulation of the newspapers, which somebody pays for. So it is a market element, right? And of course, she wanted to do something outrageous to get on the front page, because when you go by the newspaper, what's the first thing you see but the front page of that newspaper? She wanted to cause an outrage. And in this sense, this was an act that we call propaganda of the deed. In other words, she wanted to spread so take propaganda without all of its pejorative meanings. Propaganda just means spreading a message. And in this case, not through her words, through her actions. You see, the minute she hacked this painting, what did she generate? Front page news coverage. And then what happened? She was able to say in words, why did she hack this painting? Okay. And so who conducted this attack? Well, she was a suffragist. Okay. And her name is Mary Richardson. Now look at the newspaper. The newspaper is calling this an act of mutilation. It's calling Mary Richardson a butcher. But then you see what happens in the rest of the article. Because of her action, Miss Richardson, she gets an audience, okay? Why does she conduct this attack? Not against the painting, but to protest the imprisonment of somebody named Mrs. Pankhurst. Okay? In other words, she attacked a beautiful painting of a beautiful woman to protest the imprisonment of a beautiful woman who herself, Mrs. Pankhurst, was fighting for the right of women to vote. And this is what embeds it in the patriarchy of the state. Okay, this was a way of using, in other words, she took something that's cherished in society, the Rockaby Venus, attacked it and made a message. And all through the modern means of the mass circulation newspaper. And finally, this element of patriarchy of the state. Let's look here. When did women across the world get the right to vote? In other words, patriarchy of the state had to be resisted as a global movement. It was a mass global movement. Okay. 1917. So here we're talking about Russia and the Soviet, later Soviet Union. The US, 1920. Now, France, as late as 1944. Now, you would be surprised. There's one country you wouldn't obviously notice because it's far off on the map. 1893, that's New Zealand. And think about New Zealand's current prime minister, okay, who happens to be a woman, who also deftly and sensitively dealt with a massacre of Muslims about a year ago. And then, of course, was quite effective in dealing with the coronavirus outbreak. When you have a woman prime minister, then you could say the patriarchy of the state has been addressed. But then again, remember, a female prime minister has to deal with embedded patriarchy that still probably exists within the government of New Zealand, okay, but also on a global level. Okay. She has to deal with other patriarchs of the state, in other words, other men on a global level who might discredit her, demean her, or prejudge her because of the fact that she's a woman. Okay, but when women get the right to vote, is that just the only element of patriarchy of the state? No, patriarchy of the state is exhibited when the state arrests a woman for being quote unquote indecent, as in the case of this woman here. Okay. Patriarchy of the state dictates the role of women in wartime. Okay. In other words, the state would produce images like this. What's the proper role of a woman in wartime? Well, the woman stays home with the children while the men go to fight. That's a patriarchal value, okay? Other times, the state will try to mobilize women when women are needed for the modern means of mass production in the factories to create the ammunition and munitions that are the weapons of mass destruction. Then the state says, paradoxically, now get out of the house and go to the factory. We need you, okay? At the same time, now, if we jump to World War II, while the state is conducting this mass mobilization of women, you still have prejudice, okay? Because what do women naturally do? Okay. Well, according to this state-sponsored poster, they gossip. And if a woman is working at a sensitive government post, her gossip could cost lives, according to the state. And of course, the state also depicts the women, not the men, as a threat. In other words, it's the women that are the source of sexually transmitted diseases. In other words, she may look clean, but if she spread these diseases, syphilis, by the way, is a bacterium. In this age of pandemics, we should start focusing on how the diseases are spread. Okay, but it's the woman that's a threat, right? The same here, because of course the audience is, in other words, the state's not saying you men keep your, you know what in the pants so you don't get an STD, but no, it's the women that are a source of threat. A woman smoking a cigarette, wearing red and rouge is now something you should be wary of, okay? Again, the same thing here, juke joint sniper. In other words, this is a part of the longer history of kind of the patriarchy or the state managing prostitution, but this is now just telling to men, all these women, a woman who smokes is a source of danger. Okay, the same. Now let's look at the kind of continuity we see in here. It's always the woman in red, okay? Who's the source of threat? Again, now look at here you're seeing a commonality. Venereal disease covered the earth. Again, it's a woman with lipstick wearing red. That is a threat to the men serving during wartime. Now you see here, you don't necessarily have to have advertising produced by the state where the woman is the focus of the gaze. Okay. Here you have, by the way, mercury does very little to knock out syphilis. This is, of course, before how antibiotics, the age of antibiotics or modern antibiotics. But anyway, has anything changed? The woman as a source of threat. Jump to the present and let's look at this public service announcement. Okay. Somebody and 19 others were here. In other words, at the site of this woman's vagina. In other words, here the woman is now seen as the source of threat. So let's go back. So you have the woman as a source of threat, but then you also have the proper role prescribed for a woman, being in the home and taking care of the family. While the men go and fight. Now, what are liberty loans? Liberty loans are the way the state tries to subsidize the war from society. In other words, it's asking society to invest in the war effort, whereupon you will be paid back with interest once the war ends, okay? So we see here, for the safety of womanhood, the protector of childhood, for the honor of manhood. In other words, invest in the state, okay? But investing in the state also uses the image of the proper mother as part of the war effort. But nevertheless, the woman's role in this case is to stay home and raise the family. And if we go to the United Kingdom, we see a similar theme here. Now, nonetheless, of course, images like this, usually produced by the state, what do they deny? The fact that women face just as much danger as men did on the front lines, okay? And what do we tend to forget? Think in popular culture, in media, is the role of medical nurses, frontline nurses, who were detrimental to the survival of the quote-unquote menfolk on the front lines. But they more or less get written out of history or popular culture. Here is examples of patriarchy of the state in Nazi Germany. In Nazi Germany, what was the proper role for the woman in society? It was well, here you have it in translation. Germany grows through strong mothers and healthy children. Now here you also have a race element. It's not just any woman, it's the blonde kind of perfect Aryan type woman. That's going to create the perfect Aryan race in the future. At the same time, compare it to what was the role of women in Soviet society, let's say in Stalin, okay? In the Nazi image, the woman looks at the child as the future. In the Soviet image, the woman looks towards this undesignated, undefined, what future? And what future is that? Creating the perfect communist society. So in this case, in the Soviet woman, do you see it's the strong, powerful woman, not wielding a baby, but a drill, constructing what? The Moscow metro, the means of mass transportation, making the Soviet Union a modern state. Let's go back a bit earlier time, compare, let's say, and look at the role of women in revolutionary states of kind of building. Okay, so here we have the Soviet woman. This is an image from a woman in Mexico during the Revolutionary War there. So we're talking about 1910 and the decade onwards, okay? And here, what modern infrastructure is she building? The Soviet woman builds the metro. Here we have a woman brandishing a rifle and helping build the railroads that are crucial for Mexico's modernization, the mass modernity there. Now, you did actually have female Mexican revolutionaries, in fact, entire units of them. And in fact, the iconic general I won't call her Princess Leia, I'll call her General Organa. Okay, her iconic hairstyle was modeled after a Mexican revolutionary fighter. And then if we go to communist China, we see the same image. Okay? The strong, independent woman building and modernizing communist China. And so you see the similarities. All are examples of patriarchy of the state, or the state dictating or kind of projecting what is the role of women in political life. Now, if we go and compare the Soviet Union to the US, okay, and I use these two images to kind of just juxtapose. You see, juxtapose the role of women in public life. Here, the Soviet state is saying the woman by herself is going to construct Soviet society, right? And she's, you know, left alone for a reason. It's kind of to stress her individuality, creating a future. Now, if we look at the woman on the right, she has no future. Where is she looking towards? Well, she's looking down towards her arm because she has no future with a husband. Now, at the end of the day, of course, they're also emblematic of two different societies. In the Soviet Union, you didn't have private enterprise, so you wouldn't have a corporation like Listerine making an ad like this. But what is this ad trying to sell? It's just basically what it's suggesting. It's she can't get a husband because she has bad breath. Okay. Now let's go back to World War II. I gave a man, will you give at least 10% of your pay in war bonds? Here is the woman domesticated, right, raising the family. But as mass production couldn't keep up with the demand of the war, what did you need? You need more women to go work in the factory. So how does the state get women out of the house and into the assembly line? It creates Rosie the Riveter. Now, Rosie the Riveter has been appropriated as a feminist icon. But if you look at its original context, who issued this image? It's the War Production Coordinating Committee, or what might as well be called the War Mass Production Coordinating Committee. And I want you to ask, who is on this committee? Do you think it's a group of women who are managing the war effort? Or is this, in fact, in other words, Rosie the Riveter, a symbol created by men for the mass production of this war? Okay. Because you see, what do you have? You have Rosie the Riveter, which is public, but then you have these kind of guidelines given to male supervisors. In other words, how should Rosie, quote unquote, any woman, be managed on the assembly lines? Well, you see, there's very much a double standard. Okay, what does this say? Usually married women are better to have in the factory. They're more responsible than their unmarried sisters. They won't be flirting all the time. Okay, who are better workers? The husky girls. Okay. They're even more even-tempered and efficient than their underweight sisters. Okay, give female employees a day-long schedules of duty so they won't be bothering the men, basically. And so you see, while you have on one side World War II's image of an empowered woman, behind the scenes, and this is where the patriarchy is. And that's the thing, patriarchy for the most part is often hidden. This is what the men and state really think of, quote unquote, Rosie, if she stands in for any of the women who work on the factory lines. Now, again, if we jump to the Soviet Union, while during World War II, women, for the most part, fought in the factory, we could say. I'm sorry, in the Soviet Union, you actually had full entire brigades of women actually fighting. You had female snipers, you had female combat pilots, okay, before we get to that. And you had, of course, we could say throughout World War II, the history often forgets the role of female guerrilla fighters. In other words, not uniformed women, okay, but women, let's say in France, who took part in the resistance, Filipino women fighting the invading Japanese forces, are just a variety of examples of the role women actually do take part in combat. Now we jump to the present. Okay, and from this point onwards, now I have to add the caveat because while this class is on gendered, it's not a class on American politics per se. So when we ever refer to Democrats or Republicans in this class, it's not for the sake of being partisan. but nonetheless demonstrating the differences of the construction of gender. So for example, like the image like this would be an example of patriarchy of the state, but of one element of the state. In other words, the dominant party at the time when images like this are produced. Okay. And of course, patriarchy of the state, there's no better example than the debate on abortion. If you want to talk about where the state serves as a patriarch, is its role in more or less dictating what a woman can do with her body. That's the ultimate kind of evolution of the patriarchy of the state. Now, a kind of an image like this, keep in mind this was a comical article originally produced in The Onion. When a congressperson actually then believes this article and is condemning it, that's an example of patriarchy of the state. And then we conclude this lecture. I want you to go to this link and do a test where can you spot the difference between an Islamist cleric and this politician. And what is the point of this exercise? And if you go to this, it's an interactive exercise. But when you go to that page, what you will see is, again, I don't want it to be kind of partisan, but a demonstration of when we usually criticize Islam as being kind of patriarchal or misogynistic, okay, an exercise like this is meant to kind of deconstruct that dichotomy created between the two faiths. So that is the patriarchy on the religious and state level. Now, the next level will be dealing with patriarchy embedded in the language we use, okay? So what I'll do is I will end here and then continue the next lecture looking at how linguistics and narratives construct gender differences.